After returning from service to a burned-down farm and the suspicious death of his father, veteran Lucas Grayson had only one companion left, Blade, a loyal German shepherd who had grown wild. One evening, Blade led him to an old concrete foundation and began clawing frantically at the hard stone. Its eyes were filled with a desperate urgency, as if trying to reveal a buried secret that only it knew. What could be buried beneath this concrete, so important that a loyal dog would try to tear through stone to expose it? Lucas suspected the truth hidden beneath was even more dangerous than the fire that took everything from him. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The scent of ash clung to everything, a perpetual ghost of what once was. It invaded Lucas Grayson's nostrils, coating his tongue, clinging to his worn army fatigues even after he'd changed out of them. He'd arrived in the late afternoon of a Tuesday in June 2018, the Idaho sun beating down mercilessly on the scorched earth. 6 years, 6 long years since he'd last set foot on the family farm, since he'd last hugged his father, Robert Grayson, a man whose hands were as weathered as the land he'd tirelessly worked. Now, all that remained was a skeletal framework of charred timbers and the ghosts of memories. Lucas Grayson was a man carved from duty and hardship. At 32 years old, his face, usually set in a determined line, was now etched with a profound weariness that belied his age. His short-cropped dark hair was dusted with fine gray ash, mirroring the desolation around him. A veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Army Rangers, his physique was lean, powerful, and efficient, a testament to years of rigorous training and combat. But beneath the hardened exterior, his eyes, a startling shade of hazel, held a vulnerability, now intensified by grief and a growing sense of unease. He carried himself with a quiet intensity, always observing, always assessing, a habit forged in environments where a moment's inattention could cost a life. His combat boots, scuffed and familiar, crunched on the gravel path that once led to a welcoming porch. Now, they led only to sorrow. He paused by the remains of the old farmhouse, a knot tightening in his stomach. The familiar warmth, the scent of his mother's baking that lingered even years after her passing, the faint aroma of his father's pipe tobacco, all had been violently replaced by the acrid stench of destruction. A yellow police tape, faded by the sun, still fluttered half-heartedly across a section of what used to be the barn. No one had bothered to take it down. No one, it seemed, had bothered with much at all since the fire. A gruff voice broke the suffocating silence. "Mr. Grayson?" Lucas Grayson? Lucas turned, his hand instinctively going to his hip, a phantom holster on his side. Standing a few feet away was Sheriff Morgan, a man in his late 50s with a potbelly straining against his uniform shirt and a perpetually tired look in his eyes. Sheriff Morgan had been the law in Owyhee County for as long as Lucas could remember, a fixture of the sleepy rural community. He wasn't overtly hostile, but there was an unreadable quality in his gaze, a mix of professionalism and something else, something subtly off-key. "Sheriff," Lucas acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. "I came as soon as I heard." "Took you long enough," Sheriff Morgan replied, though his tone lacked real malice. "Fire was almost 3 weeks ago, August 2018. Your father—" He trailed off, looking vaguely uncomfortable. "He didn't make it. Burned alive in the house, according to the fire marshal's report. Tragic accident. Faulty wiring in the old barn." Lucas's jaw tightened. "An accident? My father was meticulous. He checked every inch of this place twice a year. Faulty wiring? He just replaced half the system last spring." Sheriff Morgan shrugged, a gesture that spoke volumes of dismissal. "Reports say otherwise, Mr. Grayson. We've done our due diligence, inspected the site, interviewed the neighbors, concluded it was an accidental electrical fire. Case closed as far as the county is concerned. He avoided Lucas's direct gaze, instead focusing on a distant tumbleweed rolling across the parched fields. I understand you're grieving. It's a tough loss. Robert was a good man. The words felt hollow, like pebbles clattering on glass. Lucas sensed an almost desperate desire from the sheriff to close this chapter, to sweep the ashes under the rug. Did you find anything? Anything at all that might suggest otherwise? Nothing, son. Just a sad, unfortunate incident. Sheriff Morgan shifted his weight, his eyes finally meeting Lucas's, but only for a fleeting second. Look, the insurance company's been calling. They'll want to talk to you, and you'll need to figure out what to do with this land. He gestured vaguely at the expanse of charred fields and scorched earth. It's not looking good, Lucas. Not good at all. He offered a perfunctory nod, then turned and lumbered back to his patrol vehicle, leaving Lucas standing amidst the desolation, the sheriff's words echoing in the oppressive silence. Case closed. But for Lucas, it felt like the case had barely begun. The sun began its slow descent, painting the Idaho sky in hues of orange and purple, a stark contrast to the monochrome of destruction below. Lucas walked aimlessly across the land his family had owned for generations. His boots kicked up dust and fragments of what used to be his home. He remembered playing here as a boy, running through fields of golden wheat, his father's hearty laugh echoing across the expanse. Now there was only the wind, whispering through dead stalks. As he reached the farthest edge of the property, near a cluster of scraggly junipers that had somehow escaped the worst of the fire, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He froze, his ranger training kicking in, his senses on high alert. Observing him from a distance of about 30 yards, partially concealed by the thin foliage, was a dog. A magnificent German shepherd, its coat a striking blend of gray and white, almost ghost-like against the muted landscape. It was undeniably a purebred, probably around 6 or 7 years old, with intelligent, piercing golden brown eyes. Its posture was one of extreme caution and distrust, its body tense, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. This wasn't a stray that had simply wandered onto the property. This dog had an air of purpose, a quiet strength, but also a deep, palpable fear of human proximity. Lucas's breath hitched. He knew that dog. He hadn't seen it in years, but the distinctive markings, the way it carried itself, it had to be. Blade, he whispered, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after so long. Blade was Robert Grayson's dog, or at least Lucas believed it was. His father had always had a German shepherd, a loyal companion. But this one looked different, more wild, more wary. It had disappeared shortly after Lucas had left for the army in 2012, or so his father had vaguely mentioned in a letter, saying Blade had run off. Now, seeing it here amidst the ruins, watching him with such intensity, Lucas felt a profound sadness mixed with a renewed sense of hope. This dog was a connection to his father, a living memory, but it was clear Blade was not the same gentle companion it once was. Its body language screamed keep away, its intelligent eyes wary, wild, haunted. It watched him for another long moment, then, with a silent, fluid motion, turned and vanished into the deepening shadows, leaving Lucas alone once more with the lingering scent of ash and the growing certainty that his father's death was no accident. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of grief and dust. Lucas took up residence in the old corrugated metal warehouse, the only structure on the property that had been spared by the flames. It was a cavernous, hollow space, smelling of rust and dry soil. A single bare bulb hanging from a long cord provided a weak, yellow light that did little to ward off the oppressive shadows. He slept on a pile of old grain sacks, using his rucksack as a pillow, the familiar weight of his Army-issue survival knife pressed against his hip, a small, cold comfort in the profound emptiness. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on him, making each breath feel heavy. His solitude was broken on the third day by the arrival of a pristine black sedan that looked ridiculously out of place against the backdrop of ruin. A man in a crisp, dark suit stepped out, his polished shoes crunching on the gravel with an air of distaste. This was Mr. Davies, the insurance investigator. He was a man in his 40s, with a meticulously styled haircut and a thin, unsmiling mouth. He carried a leather-bound portfolio and exuded an aura of detached, clinical suspicion. "Mr. Grayson," he began, his voice smooth and devoid of any genuine sympathy. "I am Arthur Davies, Senior Claims Adjuster. My condolences for your loss." The words were a formality, delivered with the same emotional investment one might use to read a grocery list. Lucas remained standing by the warehouse entrance, his arms crossed. "What do you want, Mr. Davies?" Davies opened his portfolio. "Just a few routine questions. Our records indicate your father, Robert Grayson, had a substantial life insurance policy, naming you as the sole beneficiary. Furthermore, the farm itself was insured for a considerable sum." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Business been slow lately, Mr. Grayson?" "Farming is a tough trade. We understand your father was having some financial difficulties in the last few years before his death in August 2018. The implication was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "My father was a proud man. He would never—" "Of course," Davies interrupted smoothly. "But fires are a convenient way to solve difficult financial problems, especially for someone with your particular set of skills. A man with a military background knows a thing or two about starting them, wouldn't you say?" Rage, hot and blinding, surged through Lucas. He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "Are you accusing me of something?" For the first time, a flicker of something other than professional detachment appeared in Davies's eyes. A smug satisfaction. "I'm merely exploring all possibilities, Mr. Grayson. It's my job. We will be conducting a thorough investigation. Don't leave the county." With a curt nod, he turned, got back into his air-conditioned car, and drove away, leaving a plume of dust and a cloud of poison in his wake. The investigator's visit was the turning point. When Lucas drove into the small town of Murphy for supplies, he felt the change. The friendly nods he used to receive were replaced by averted gazes. Whispers followed him down the aisle of the general store. The woman at the checkout counter, who had known him since he was a boy, suddenly couldn't meet his eyes, her movements brisk and dismissive. The poison had spread. He was no longer just the grieving son of a local farmer. He was a suspect, a pariah. The isolation was now complete, a wall built of rumor and suspicion. He returned to the hollow shell of the farm, the silence more profound than ever. But he was not entirely alone. Every morning he would see Blade, watching from the edge of the juniper trees. The dog was a phantom, a gray and white ghost haunting the periphery of his world. Lucas knew he couldn't force a reunion. Trust, once broken, had to be rebuilt piece by piece. He started simply. Each morning and evening, he would fill a dented metal bowl with fresh water and another with the dry dog food he'd bought in town. He would place them near the edge of the burned-out foundation, a neutral ground between his warehouse and Blade's wilderness, and then retreat. Hours later, when he checked, the food and water would be gone. After a few days of this silent ritual, he began to talk to the dog. He would sit on an overturned bucket a good 50 yards from the bowls, his voice low and steady, a gentle murmur against the ever-present wind. He didn't call the dog or command it, he just spoke. He talked about his father, about the long days they spent fixing fences, about the smell of the earth after a rainstorm. He spoke of his time overseas, the dust and the noise, and how the memory of these quiet fields had kept him sane. Blade would listen, his head cocked, his intelligent eyes fixed on Lucas. He never came closer, but he stopped vanishing immediately. He would stay, a silent, watchful presence for as long as Lucas spoke. The breakthrough came a week after Lucas's return. The weight of it all, the grief, the suspicion, the crushing loneliness, became too much. Lucas sat by the foundation, his head in his hands, a dry sob catching in his throat. He didn't make a sound, but his shoulders shook with the force of his despair. He felt, more than saw, a change in the space around him. He slowly lifted his head. Blade was there. Not 30 yards away, but a mere 10. He was standing, his body still tense, but the fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else, a hesitant empathy. He let out a soft whine, a sound that was not a growl of warning but a question. Lucas stayed perfectly still, his heart pounding. "Hey, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's okay. It's okay." Blade took another tentative step, then another. The distance closed with an agonizing slowness, each footfall a monumental act of trust. Finally, the dog was standing just before him, close enough for Lucas to smell the scent of wild sage and dust on his coat. Lucas slowly extended a hand, palm up, and waited. Blade watched the hand for a long moment, then leaned forward and gently nudged it with his wet nose. The simple touch was an absolution. A wave of relief so powerful it left Lucas lightheaded washed over him. He gently stroked the dog's head, his fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur. Blade leaned into the touch, a low rumble of contentment vibrating in his chest. The silence had been broken. From that day on, Blade was his shadow. He still wouldn't enter the warehouse, preferring the open air, but he was always there, a steady, reassuring presence at Lucas's side. The wall of isolation had been breached by a bond that needed no words. On the third evening after their reunion, Lucas noticed a change in Blade's behavior. The dog grew restless, pacing back and forth near the warehouse entrance. He would whine, nudge Lucas with his nose, and then trot a few paces away, looking back expectantly. "What is it, boy?" "What's wrong?" Lucas asked. Blade barked, a single, sharp sound full of purpose. He then led Lucas away from the ruins of the main house, past the charred barn, and to a forgotten corner of the property, right beside the very warehouse Lucas was living in. Here, half overgrown with weeds, was a flat, wide slab of concrete, the foundation of an old dairy shed that had been torn down decades ago. Lucas had walked over it 100 times without a second thought. But Blade stopped directly in the center of it, his entire body quivering with a strange intensity. He lowered his nose to the ground, sniffing frantically at one particular spot. Then, he began to dig. His powerful front paws scraped uselessly against the hard, unforgiving surface of the concrete, the sound loud in the quiet twilight. He whined with frustration, looked up at Lucas with an expression of desperate urgency, and then went back to scratching at the solid slab, his claws clicking against the stone. He was not just digging randomly. He was trying to show Lucas something hidden, something buried deep beneath the concrete. Blade's frantic digging against the unyielding concrete resonated in the quiet twilight, a desperate plea for understanding. Lucas watched the dog, his mind racing. This wasn't just playful scratching. This was an animal with a mission, driven by something deep and urgent. The dog's eyes, usually wary, now burned with an intensity that brooked no argument. "All right, boy," Lucas murmured, a tremor in his voice. "All right. I hear you." He knelt beside Blade, running his hand over the rough concrete. The slab was old, cracked in places, but solid. Blade continued to scratch at a specific spot, a faint discoloration on the gray surface. Lucas examined it closely, his ranger training kicking in, observing, analyzing, searching for the anomalous. There, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, was a faint seam, perfectly straight, running across the concrete. It wasn't a natural crack. It was a cut, a deliberate, precise cut. Lucas knew concrete. To make a cut like that, one needed specialized equipment, a wet saw with a diamond blade. His father, Robert Grayson, had been a jack of all trades, a man who could fix anything and build anything. He had owned such a saw, used for various farm projects over the years. This wasn't a random spot. His father had made this cut. Returning to the warehouse, Lucas rummaged through the sparse tools that had been spared by the fire. He found an old crowbar and a heavy-duty sledgehammer. Blade watched him, his tail wagging tentatively, a spark of anticipation in his golden-brown eyes. Back at the concrete slab, Lucas positioned the tip of the crowbar into the faint seam. He struck the end of the crowbar with the sledgehammer, sending a jarring vibration through the ground. The concrete groaned, a low, grinding sound. He repeated the action again and again, the rhythmic thud echoing in the stillness of the night. It was slow, back-breaking work, fueled by a grim determination. After what felt like hours, a section of the concrete, roughly 2 feet by 2 feet, finally gave way with a sharp crack. It lifted slightly. With a grunt, Lucas leveraged the crowbar, prying the heavy slab upwards and pushing it to the side. Blade let out a triumphant bark, peering into the dark opening. Beneath the slab, nestled in a small, meticulously dug cavity, was a fireproof safe. It was a compact, heavy-duty model, designed to withstand extreme temperatures and impact. This wasn't some flimsy metal box. This was a serious piece of equipment, chosen by a man who knew he might need to protect something vital. It was exactly the kind of careful, foresightful planning Lucas would expect from his father. "Good boy, Blade," Lucas said, reaching down to pat the dog's head. Blade nudged his hand affectionately, then sat patiently as Lucas worked. The safe was locked, of course. Lucas examined it. His father had been old school, preferring mechanical locks to electronic ones, which could fail or be hacked. He knelt, pulling a small, worn leather pouch from his pocket, a collection of lock-picking tools he'd carried since his ranger days, a skill often useful in unexpected ways. He ran his fingers over the tumblers, listening intently to the faint clicks as he manipulated the pins. It was a familiar, meditative process, a focus that momentarily pushed aside his grief. After a few tense minutes, there was a final, satisfying click, and the heavy door swung open. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, were 2 items: a thick, leather-bound journal and a sleek, silver USB drive. Lucas carefully retrieved them. The journal felt heavy and solid in his hands, its pages yellowed with age, filled with his father's distinctive, careful handwriting. He sat down on the ground, Blade settling beside him, his head resting on Lucas's knee. The light was fading fast, but there was just enough ambient glow to read. Lucas opened the journal to the first entry. It began simply, dated January 2017. "The land is changing. I feel it in my bones. And it's not just the weather." Robert Grayson's entries detailed his growing concerns. He wrote about the strange blight affecting his crops, a disease that seemed to only strike those who hadn't switched to the new improved fertilizers offered by Viridian Agrotech. He documented the visits from aggressive representatives of the company, pressuring him to sell his land, hinting at impending doom for those who resisted. Robert's handwriting grew more urgent in the later entries. He wrote about Vincent Rourke, the ruthless CEO of Viridian Agrotech. Rourke was a name that had begun to appear in local news a few years prior, a shrewd businessman who had aggressively expanded his company's reach into Owyhee County, buying up struggling farms, consolidating land, and introducing innovative new agricultural products. Robert described Rourke as a man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, a man who spoke of progress while leaving a trail of broken promises and disillusioned farmers. The journal revealed Robert's meticulous, almost scientific approach to his suspicions. He had taken samples of soil and water, had meticulously recorded the yields of his crops versus those of his neighbors using Viridian products. He spoke of a particular chemical, Solace, Viridian's flagship product, that seemed to be at the heart of the problem. Robert believed Solace was not just a fertilizer, but something far more insidious. He sensed a larger, darker game at play, a corporate land grab disguised as agricultural innovation. The last entry, dated just a few days before the fire in August 2018, was stark and chilling. They know I'm onto them. Rourke himself paid me a visit. He made threats. Not direct, but clear enough. He wants this land. He wants all of it. If anything happens to me, Lucas, know this. It was not an accident. Look for the truth. It's hidden where you least expect it. Trust Blade. He knows. Lucas closed the journal, his hands trembling. His father had known. He had fought, and he had been murdered. The grief, now laced with a burning anger, solidified into a resolve colder and harder than the concrete slab they had just unearthed. The sheriff's accident was a lie. The next morning, Lucas drove into town. He stopped at a modest office on Main Street, its sign faded but respectable. Benjamin Carter, attorney at law. Benjamin Carter was a man in his early 60s, with a kind, weary face framed by thinning gray hair and a pair of spectacles perched on his nose. He had been the Grayson family's lawyer for decades, handling everything from land deeds to occasional livestock disputes. He greeted Lucas with a somber handshake, his eyes reflecting genuine sorrow. "Lucas, my boy, I am so sorry about Robert. He was a good friend." Lucas cut to the chase. He placed the journal and the USB drive on Carter's cluttered desk. "My father was murdered, Mr. Carter. This is what I found." Carter picked up the journal, his brow furrowed as he read the last entries. His face paled. "Robert. He told me he was looking into something big. But he wouldn't give me details, said it was too dangerous. He only mentioned Viridian Agrotech, said they were sharks." He looked at Lucas, his expression grave. "He did warn me to expect trouble. He made me promise, if anything ever happened, to assist you in any way I could." "Did he leave anything with you?" Lucas asked. Carter nodded slowly. "He did. A sealed envelope. He insisted that I hold on to it, and only give it to you if something happened to him. Said it contained critical information about his investigation. He was a thorough man, Robert, always thinking ahead." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope, sealed with red wax. "I suspect it might contain more details about what's on that USB drive." He pushed the envelope across the desk. "Lucas, you need to understand. Vincent Rourke and Viridian Agrotech, they're powerful. They have deep pockets. They own politicians. They own judges. They might even own people in law enforcement. Taking them on is like going up against a storm. Your father was a brave man. Be careful." Lucas picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of his father's legacy and his warning. "I will be, Mr. Carter. But I'm not going to stop. Not until I find out the truth." He glanced at Blade, who was patiently waiting by the door, his eyes fixed on Lucas. Blade knew. His father had trusted the dog, and now so would Lucas. The drive back from Benjamin Carter's office was a silent, somber affair. Lucas sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, the sealed envelope from the lawyer on the passenger seat beside the journal and the USB drive. It was a small pile of objects that represented the entirety of his father's final, desperate fight. The weight of it all settled on him, a burden of truth and a mandate for justice. Blade sat beside the pile, his head up, eyes forward, a silent, steady presence in the swirling chaos of Lucas's thoughts. In the days that followed, the warehouse ceased to be a mere shelter and became a makeshift command center. The profound loneliness that had threatened to consume Lucas was held at bay by the quiet companionship of the dog. They fell into a rhythm, a routine forged in their shared solitude. They were a team now, their bond solidifying with each passing hour. No longer just a man and a dog, but partners in a silent mission. Every interaction with Blade was a bittersweet echo of the past, a way for Lucas to reconnect with the father he had lost. When he shared his meager meals, canned stew or jerky, he would watch Blade eat with a patient, dignified focus, and he would remember his father doing the same, tossing scraps to a younger Blade with a low chuckle, saying, "A good dog earns his keep, and you, my friend, are the best." Lucas found himself talking to Blade constantly, not because he expected an answer, but because the dog was a vessel for his memories. As he groomed Blade's thick gray and white coat, picking out burrs from their walks, he would feel the familiar texture of the fur under his hands and recall Robert teaching him how to do it properly. "Always brush with the grain, son. Show him respect, and he'll give you his loyalty." Each gentle stroke was a conversation with a ghost, a way of feeling his father's presence in the here and now. Blade, in turn, seemed to understand. He would lean into Lucas's touch, a low rumble of contentment in his chest, his golden brown eyes full of an ancient, knowing sadness. He was no longer the feral, fearful creature from the woods. He was a guardian, a confidant, a living link to a life that had been stolen. One afternoon, Lucas sat on the warehouse floor, the journal open in his lap. He was trying to decipher some of his father's more cryptic notes about land parcels and chemical compositions. But the technical jargon was dense, and his frustration was mounting. He felt stuck, adrift in a sea of data without a map. He let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. Blade, who had been dozing near the open door, lifted his head, his ears perked. He seemed to sense the shift in Lucas's demeanor. He rose, stretched his powerful frame, and walked over, nudging Lucas's hand with his cold, wet nose. "I don't know where to look next, boy," Lucas said, his voice low. "He says the proof is in the land, but all I see is ash." Blade whined softly, then nudged him again, this time more insistently. When Lucas didn't move, the dog turned and trotted to the doorway, looking back over his shoulder, his tail giving a single, expectant wag. It was the same look he'd had before leading him to the concrete slab. He had somewhere else to go. "You have another idea?" Lucas asked, a flicker of hope stirring within him. Blade let out a short, sharp bark of confirmation. Trusting the dog's intuition, which had proven more reliable than any human investigation so far, Lucas closed the journal, grabbed a flashlight and his rucksack, and followed. Blade didn't lead him toward the road or the neighboring farms. Instead, he headed for the dense woods that bordered the back of the Grayson property, plunging into the trees along a narrow, overgrown path that was little more than a deer trail. This was not a public route. This was a path worn by familiar feet, a secret way known only to someone who had walked this land for a lifetime. Lucas pushed through low-hanging pine branches, the air growing cooler and smelling of damp earth and pine needles. It was a relief to be away from the scent of ash, to be in a place that still felt alive. He remembered this trail from his childhood, a place he and his father would walk, his father pointing out different types of trees and animal tracks. It was a path to his father's sanctuary. After a 20-minute walk, they emerged into a small, secluded clearing. Nestled in the center was a small hunting cabin, a familiar sight from Lucas's youth. It was a simple, sturdy structure made of rough-hewn logs, with a single stone chimney and a small, weathered porch. It was the place Robert Grayson had always come to think, to escape the pressures of the farm, to be alone with his thoughts. It was a place of profound peace and solitude. The door was unlocked. Lucas pushed it open, a wave of nostalgia washing over him. The air inside was still and cool, smelling of old wood, canvas, and the faint, lingering scent of his father's pipe tobacco. It was Spartan, furnished with only a simple cot, a small wood-burning stove, and a single wooden table and chair. A worn flannel shirt, one of his father's favorites, was still hanging from a peg on the wall. It felt as though his father had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. This place, untouched by the fire, was a perfect time capsule of the man Robert Grayson had been. Lucas began to search, his movements methodical. He checked under the cot, inside the cold stove, behind the loose stones of the hearth. He found nothing but dust and mouse droppings. He sat down at the table, a feeling of disappointment settling in. Perhaps he had been wrong to follow. Perhaps this was just a place Blade remembered fondly. But Blade was not idle. He hadn't been sniffing randomly. He bypassed all the obvious hiding spots and went directly to a corner of the small cabin near the base of the stone chimney. He began sniffing intently at the wooden floorboards, his nose twitching. He whined, a low, urgent sound, and began scratching at one specific plank, the sound sharp in the quiet cabin. He looked up at Lucas, his eyes pleading, before resuming his frantic scratching. It was the same look, the same desperate intensity as before. "You found something again, didn't you, boy?" Lucas whispered. He knelt down, examining the floorboard. It looked identical to the others, old and worn. But when he pressed on it, there was a faint give, a slight movement the others didn't have. Using the tip of his survival knife, he carefully worked it into the seam and pried. The board came up with a soft groan of old wood. Beneath it was a small hidden compartment. And inside that compartment was a heavy, lead-lined box. Lucas's breath caught. A lead-lined box was used to block scents and signals, the kind of thing a careful man would use to hide something he never wanted to be found by accident. He lifted the box out. It was heavy, sealed with a simple clasp. He opened it. Inside, nestled in protective cotton batting, were a dozen small glass jars. Each jar was filled with either dark, sickly-looking soil or cloudy, murky water. And on each jar was a small, neatly handwritten label. Lucas picked one up. Sample 4B, Miller's Creek downstream from Viridian Runoff, June 2018. He picked up another. Sample 7A, Soil from Donovan's North Pasture after Solace Treatment, July 2018. This was it. This was the physical proof. His father hadn't just suspected. He had been building a scientific case. He had been collecting evidence of the poison that was seeping into their land, into their water. He had hidden it here, in his most private sanctuary, protected by a loyal guardian who would only reveal it to the right person. Lucas looked at Blade, who sat watching him, panting softly. "He trusted you," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. "He trusted you to show me. You're more than just a dog, aren't you? You're his legacy." The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet main street of Murphy as Lucas pushed open the door to Benjamin Carter's law office. Blade was at his heels, moving with a quiet confidence that was a world away from the fearful, feral creature he had been just weeks ago. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of their purpose, his golden brown eyes watchful and alert. Lucas placed the lead-lined box on Carter's desk with a heavy thud. The lawyer, who had been poring over a dusty legal tome, looked up over his spectacles, his expression shifting from scholarly curiosity to sharp focus, as Lucas opened the lid to reveal the carefully labeled jars of soil and water. "My father's fieldwork," Lucas said, his voice flat and hard. "This is the proof from the land." Now we need to see the proof from the inside. He placed the silver USB drive on the desk beside the journal. Carter picked up the drive, examining it. Robert was always a step ahead. He knew a paper trail could be burned, but a digital one, that's harder to erase completely. He plugged the drive into his computer. A moment later, his brow furrowed in frustration. A single window popped up on his screen, demanding a complex alphanumeric password. It's encrypted, military grade by the looks of it. Robert didn't leave any notes? A password hint? Lucas shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. My father was a ranger in Vietnam before he was a farmer. He taught me that if you want to keep something safe, you make it so only one other person can open it. Someone who thinks like you do. He sat down at the computer. The password prompt had a question. Where the river remembers the sky. It wasn't a question for a stranger. It was a message for his son. Lucas closed his eyes, picturing the farm, the rolling hills, the endless Idaho sky. He remembered a place, a high ridge on the property where the river below was so still and clear it perfectly mirrored the clouds above. It was his mother's favorite spot. His father had called it Heaven's Mirror. He typed the words into the password field, Heaven's Mirror 2003, the year his mother had passed away. A second of tense silence. Then the encryption barrier vanished, revealing a meticulously organized set of folders. How did you know? Carter breathed, his eyes wide with astonishment. He knew I would remember, Lucas replied softly. For the next several hours, the only sounds in the small, dusty office were the quiet clicking of the mouse, the rustle of paper, and Blade's soft, rhythmic breathing as he lay on the floor. What they uncovered was a conspiracy far more insidious and cold-blooded than Lucas had ever imagined. The first folder contained encrypted emails, a chain of correspondence between Vincent Rourke and his top executives. The language was sterile, corporate, but the meaning was chillingly clear when cross-referenced with Robert's journal. They never used words like poison or sabotage. Instead, they talked of aggressive nutrient depletion cycles and market-driven land consolidation. One email from Rourke stood out. The Grayson property remains the final holdout. His resistance is impacting the timeline for Phase 2. Expedite the acquisition protocol. I don't want any more delays. It was a death sentence, written in the language of a business memo. The second folder was labeled Financials, and it contained a web of suspicious money transfers. They found ledgers detailing large, anonymous payments funneled through shell corporations. These payments went to a handful of individuals in Owyhee County, including a recurring payment to an account that, after some clever digging by Carter through public records, was linked to a close relative of Sheriff Morgan. So that's why he was so eager to close the case, Carter said, his voice laced with disgust. He wasn't just incompetent, he was compromised, bought and paid for. But the most damning evidence was in the final folder, titled simply Project Solace. Inside was a single password-protected file. This password was different, a string of scientific variables. Lucas found it scrawled on a small piece of paper tucked into the back of his father's journal. It was the key to the truth. The file opened to reveal the complete, unredacted laboratory report on the chemical known as Solace. It was a 200-page scientific document filled with charts, graphs, and chemical analyses. The public-facing marketing material Lucas had seen described Solace as a revolutionary fertilizer that boosted crop yields by 300%. This report told the real story. Solace was a masterpiece of malevolent chemistry. It worked by triggering a plant's growth hormones into overdrive, forcing a massive, unsustainable burst of life. But to fuel this growth, it simultaneously attacked and destroyed the vital microorganisms in the soil, the bacteria and fungi responsible for creating nutrients and maintaining the land's long-term health. The report concluded that after 3 to 5 years of Salus application, the soil would be rendered completely sterile, unable to support any life without massive and constant chemical intervention. Chemicals that only Viridian Agrotech sold. Lucas felt a cold sickness spread through his gut. This wasn't just a business. It was a protection racket on a massive scale. Rourke wasn't just selling a product, he was selling an addiction. He was a dealer, and his drug was a chemical that murdered the land itself. The full picture slammed into Lucas and Carter with the force of a physical blow. They finally understood Rourke's monstrous plan. It was a slow, patient, and methodical conquest. He would identify a target region, introduce Salus through aggressive marketing, and wait. As the farms began to fail, as the land died beneath the farmers' feet, Viridian Agrotech would sweep in, offering to buy the now worthless properties for pennies on the dollar. He wasn't just building a company. He was building an empire on the ashes of family farms. And Lucas's father, Robert Grayson, had figured it all out. He had the journal documenting the timeline. He had the physical samples from the poisoned land. And he had this USB drive with the internal communications and the scientific proof. He wasn't just a resistant landowner. He was the one man who could bring Rourke's entire empire crashing down. His death wasn't just a possibility, it was an inevitability. He hadn't been killed because he was in the way. He had been executed because he knew the truth. Lucas leaned back in his chair, the screen's glow reflecting in his hard, hazel eyes. The grief was still there, a deep, aching void. But now it was accompanied by something else, something cold and pure and terrifyingly focused. It was rage. A controlled rage, honed by years of discipline and combat, but rage nonetheless. This was no longer just about avenging his father. This was about stopping a war that Rourke had declared on his home, on his community, on the very earth beneath their feet. He looked down at Blade. The dog had lifted his head and was looking up at him, his gaze steady and unwavering. He seemed to sense the change, the shift from grief to resolve. Lucas reached down and placed a hand on the dog's head. "He started this fight, boy," Lucas whispered, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "We're going to finish it." The weight of the truth was a physical burden. With the evidence laid bare, Lucas Grayson understood the full scope of Vincent Rourke's war, but he also understood his own isolation. Benjamin Carter was a good man and a capable lawyer, but he was a man of books and statutes. The fight ahead required a different set of skills, and Lucas knew he couldn't wage this war alone. The first calls he made were to the ghosts of his past, men from his ranger unit who had settled back into civilian life. The process was a harsh lesson in the realities of the world outside the military. The first man, a demolitions expert now running a construction business in Arizona, listened patiently before giving his regrets. "I'm sorry, Lucas. I really am. But I've got a wife and 2 kids now. I can't bring that kind of trouble to their doorstep." The second, a communications specialist in Oregon, was more blunt. "A corporation? You want to go up against a billionaire and his army of lawyers? You're on your own, man. That's suicide." He even tried speaking to a few of the neighboring ranchers, men his father had known for decades. He showed them the soil analysis, explained what Viridian was doing to their land. He saw flickers of recognition, of dawning horror in their eyes. But it was always extinguished by fear. Rourke's influence was a suffocating blanket over the entire county. They would offer quiet condolences, a sad shake of the head, and then retreat behind locked doors. Each refusal was a fresh wound, deepening his sense of isolation. He had the truth, but the truth was useless without the courage to wield it. Dejected, Lucas sat in his truck outside the Murphy General Store, Blade's head resting on his thigh, a warm, reassuring weight. There was one last call he could make. A man he'd served with through 2 brutal tours, a man who had pulled him out of a firefight in the Korengal Valley in 2013. He hadn't wanted to drag him into this, but he was out of options. He dialed the number. "Cross," a calm, deep voice answered on the second ring. "Ben, it's Lucas." There was a pause. "Lucas Grayson. Man, it's been years. I heard about your father. I'm sorry." "That's why I'm calling, Ben. It wasn't an accident." Lucas spent the next 20 minutes laying it all out, his voice low and steady, presenting the facts with the dispassionate clarity of a field report. He spoke of the fire, the journal, the encrypted files, the poison called Solace. Benjamin Cross, a former Army Ranger sergeant, was now the head of security for a tech firm in Boise. He was a big man, built like a linebacker, with a shaved head and a tranquil demeanor that concealed a mind that was always calculating angles. He was the rock, the immovable object to Lucas's irresistible force. He listened without interruption, his silence more telling than 1,000 questions. "You're asking for a lot, Lucas," Ben said finally, his voice heavy. "This isn't some warlord in a mud hut. This is a corporate giant on home soil. They play dirty." "I know," Lucas said, "but he murdered my father. I can't let that go." Another long silence stretched between them. Lucas could hear the faint hum of office life on Ben's end, a world away from the dust and ash of the Grayson farm. "I'll be there tomorrow," Ben said, and the line went dead. True to his word, Ben arrived the next day. Seeing his old friend, solid and dependable, was the first real hope Lucas had felt in weeks. They spent the evening going over the evidence. Ben's expertise was in risk assessment and operations. He saw the enemy clearly, but also saw their own weaknesses. "We have the what and the why," Ben concluded, pointing at the files on Lucas's laptop. "But we're missing the how. We need more intel on their current operations. And we need a way to get this story out that they can't kill with lawyers. We need someone who operates outside the system." He looked at Lucas. "I think I know someone. She's difficult, but she's the best there is." 2 days later, they were in a cramped third-floor apartment in a rundown part of Boise, the air thick with the hum of electronics and the smell of stale coffee. Madeline Brooks was a whirlwind of nervous energy. In her late 20s, she was small and wiry, with a shock of spiky, dyed black hair and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. She wore a faded band t-shirt and cargo pants, and a series of complex silver rings adorned her fingers as they flew across a keyboard. Her apartment was a digital nest, with 3 monitors displaying scrolling lines of code, a server rack humming in the corner, and a web of cables snaking across the floor. She had been a rising star in investigative journalism until an exposé she wrote on Veridian Agrotech's labor practices in 2016 was systematically dismantled and buried, costing her the job and her reputation. Now, she was a freelance hacker and digital journalist, a ghost in the machine who waged war from the shadows. She looked at Lucas and Ben with profound cynicism. "Let me guess," she said without looking up from her screen. "You're the good soldiers here to save the world, right?" "I've heard that one before." "We're not here to save the world," Lucas said, his voice even. "We're here for justice. You wrote about Veridian before. You know what they're capable of." "Knowing and proving are 2 different things," she shot back, finally turning to face them, her gaze sharp and appraising. "And proving it without getting crushed is a third. What do you have that's better than what I had?" Lucas didn't argue. He simply placed the USB drive on the desk beside her keyboard. "My father's legacy. See for yourself." Madeline eyed the drive with suspicion, then plugged it into her system. Her initial skepticism slowly melted away, replaced by a focused intensity. Her fingers danced across the keys, bypassing the simple password Lucas had used, peeling back layers of hidden code. "Your father was good," she muttered, a hint of professional respect in her voice. "He hid partitioned data within the file architecture itself." For an hour, she worked in silence, her eyes wide as she navigated the labyrinth of corruption. She saw the real Solace report, the financial trails, the cold-blooded emails. She saw the truth. "This is it," she whispered, leaning back, her face pale. "This is everything. They didn't just ruin my career. They're killing people." She looked at Lucas, the cynicism in her eyes replaced by a burning, righteous anger that mirrored his own. "Okay, soldier. You've got my attention. What's the plan?" With Madeline on board, the team had its brain. She immediately began digging, her digital tendrils spreading into Viridian's network. "We need a human face for this," she said after a day of furious research. "The data is damning, but people connect with people. I've found him. A rancher, third generation. Viridian is about to foreclose on his land. He's been using Solace for 4 years. His name is Michael Donovan." They found Michael Donovan on his failing ranch, a mirror image of what the Grayson farm could have become. He was a man in his 50s, his shoulders slumped with the weight of defeat. His face a roadmap of sun-beaten worry. He was distrustful at first, hearing the rumors that Lucas was a fraud. But Lucas didn't approach him as a soldier. He spoke to him as a farmer's son. He walked the dying fields with Donovan, took a handful of the dry, lifeless soil. He showed him his father's journal, the soil samples, the lab report. He showed Donovan that this failure was not his fault, that he had been systematically poisoned and deceived. Tears welled in the older man's eyes as he looked at the proof. The shame he had carried for years was replaced by a slow-burning anger. "That son of a..." he choked out. "He came to my door, promising a miracle." He looked at Lucas, his expression hardening with resolve. "What do you need me to do?" That evening, the 4 of them gathered in the dusty warehouse. Lucas, the soldier and leader, Ben, the strategist and rock, Madeline, the digital ghost and truth-teller, and Michael, the heart of the community and the voice of the victims. A small, improbable team united by grief and anger, ready to fight back. The silence no longer felt like isolation. It felt like the calm before a storm.